Good evening, everybody. It's Kath Maloney here. Just while we're waiting for a few more people to join in, we will start by just noting that if you don't want your image, your face displayed as we're talking, to make sure that your camera is switched off. You can switch it back on again if you want to. So just noting that if your camera is switched on, everybody can see you, which we always say we don't mind, but you just need to be aware of that. And secondly, just to use the function, the chat room function. So as you have questions, please use the function as those questions come to mind, and we will come back to them at the end of the presentation and go through your questions. And depending on how many numbers we've got, what the logistics are, we can probably open the mics up at that point too, at which point you might want to switch your camera back on, but we'll see how we go. So it is 6:31, so we will get underway, and I've noticed that Ilse has joined us too, so we will get started. So I'd like to welcome you all tonight and begin by paying respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting this evening, and especially our elders past, present and future, and to anybody who might be joining the webinar this evening. My name is Kath Maloney. I'm the Acting Chief Executive for SARRAH. And we're joined this evening by Ilse Nielsen, who is the Acting Director Allied Health from Queensland Health. Ilse, are you live? Are you able to say good day?
I am. Hello, Kat. Sorry, I was having some video problems, but I think I should be coming through.
Yep, can see you, absolutely. And hopefully your voice lasts the evening. So,
indeed.
Yes. All right, so we will get underway. This is about, okay, there we go. Because I know that there's a few people out there who are not SARRAH members and may not be that familiar with this, I just thought I'd start by a little bit of an explanation about who SARRAH is. SARRAH is the peak body representing allied health professionals living and working in rural and remote Australia. SARRAH exists so that rural and remote communities have access to high quality allied health services that support rural communities to achieve optimal levels of wellness and resilience. For nearly 25 years, SARRAH has sustained a strong reputation for representing the issues facing rural and remote allied health professionals in relation to the needs of the communities they serve. We have a range of submissions. We're very active in the policy and advocacy space, and they are all available on our website if you'd like to know more about our policy and advocacy work. Our strategy is to create an environment that supports allied health professionals working in rural and remote Australia to thrive personally and professionally. We do this by building a community of health leaders dedicated to better health for rural and remote Australia, developing the rural allied health workforce pipeline to meet the needs of rural and remote Australia, working collaboratively with our members and partners to achieve equity for rural and remote Australia, and shaping the future health services that reflect the needs of rural and remote Australia through our advocacy activities. All right, so, but tonight we're talking about the Allied Health Rural Generalist Pathway. The pathway was born out of ongoing challenges associated with the recruitment and retention of allied health professionals in rural and remote locations. The issue has gained prominence in recent times as a result of the National Rural Health Commissioner's recent work on access, distribution and quality of allied health services in rural and remote Australia. And there is a final report and recommendations going to the Rural Health Minister in October. And SARRAH, as part of the Australian Allied Health Leadership Forum, has been working closely with the Commissioner to shape that document and those recommendations. The geographic maldistribution of the allied health workforce persists despite an increased number of students training in allied health disciplines, significant investment in the university departments of rural health, and the funding injection by Health Workforce Australia between 2012 and 2014 to provide rural clinical placements for allied health and nursing students to expose them to rural lifestyle and rural practice. While these consultations were taking place, SARRAH was commissioned by New South Wales Health to write a rapid review outlining the strategies that supported allied health recruitment and retention in Australia. And so to set the scene, I'd just like to take you through some of the findings from that review. So the review describes the elements of a rural workforce pipeline extending across the career continuum from university to mature career practitioner, and the supporting mechanisms to ensure pipeline supply at every stage in an allied health professional's career. The key components of the training elements of the pipeline are quality rural clinical placements for students, programs and supports to enable early career practitioners to develop the clinical and non-clinical skills and capabilities they need for rural practice, CPD and training opportunities for established career practitioners, and to develop the advanced skill and non-clinical skills that they need to meet the needs of their community and service environment. And then there are, under mentoring, supervision and support, from the literature, the important components appeared to be vocational planning, case managing people into rural practice, preceptor or clinical educator roles, mentoring, flexible supervision arrangements, and business development supports for people considering going into private practice. Another issue that deserves some attention is to consider service development strategies. They are becoming embedded in the rural and remote allied health service system through increased use of Cert 4 trained therapy assistants, skill sharing between allied health professions, greater use of telehealth for the assessment and clinical advice, as well as providing supervision and support. This enables allied health practitioners to work to full scope of practice so that they have the potential to improve job satisfaction, promote retention, and importantly, increase service capacity and efficiency. And our full review is available on our website if you'd like further information. So where does the Allied Health Rural Generalist Pathway fit in? The context of allied health service delivery in rural and remote areas differs to metropolitan practice with allied health professionals working across the lifespan and in different sectors. Rural allied health professionals require a broad set of clinical and non-clinical skills and capabilities to meet the needs of rural communities. The Allied Health Rural Generalist Pathway is an early career professional development framework that develops an allied health professional's clinical competency within their own profession, plus areas of depth or special skills that match service and community needs. The Rural Generalist Pathway could be an incentive for early career allied health professionals considering a move to rural practice, in that it provides structured supports to trainees to develop a broad range of clinical skills and a recognised qualification on completion. The Rural Generalist Pathway offers a platform that enables relationships with education providers and health service providers to develop, from which an allied health professional can start to plot out a rural career trajectory. Keeping these practitioners in the rural workforce is critical for ongoing workforce development and driving structural change if we are seeking to progress to something like a rural pipeline. I'm now going to hand over to Ilse Nielsen from Queensland Health, who is going to provide further detail about the pathway. So Ilse, over to you.
Thanks, Kath. Thanks for the opportunity to present on the pathway today. As Kath mentioned at the top, I'm just coming out of laryngitis, so my voice is a bit rough, so apologies for that. Okay, so the Allied Health Rural Generalist Pathway is an integrated workforce, service and education strategy designed to improve the outcomes and sustainability of rural and multi-professional teams. I think crucially, in our first discussion about what the pathway means, is that the pathway includes service, workforce and employment, and education and training strategies. So when we talk about the pathway, we acknowledge that there are those three main components, but the pathway itself implements all three simultaneously, and hopefully producing an outcome which is greater than the sum of those individual parts. Rural generalist service models within the pathway are designed such that they maximise the use of the allied health professionals' full scope and can optimise the value that the allied health professionals provide to their team and their community. The workforce and employment element of the pathway includes early career designated training positions and employment arrangements that are focused on development, support and retention of allied health professionals in their rural or remote service. And the education and training component includes a formal post-professional entry, so postgraduate training program, which is aligned to the community and service needs and is also embedded within the local supervision and work integrated training structures of the organisation. Next slide, please, Kat. So now I'm just going to go through each of those three components, service, workforce and education, in a little more detail. So rural generalist services are aligned to community needs and often provided across multiple settings, including inpatient, outpatient and community settings. Rural generalist services utilise service delivery strategies that are designed to address the challenges of having small workforces, providing services across large geographical areas to dispersed populations and culturally diverse populations. So with that general concept in mind, the four service delivery strategies that you'll see reflected within the rural generalist pathway through the education program, through the service development components of the pathway, telehealth, delegation and better use of support workers, such as allied health assistants, extended scope, including skill sharing tasks between professions, and finally partnerships that bring care closer to home for rural and remote communities and rural and remote consumers. And this would include rural-urban collaborative care, such as collaborative care arrangements between tertiary or specialist services in urban locations, and also rural and remote local interagency integrated care arrangements. Now, rural generalist health professionals. So a rural generalist health professional is capable of providing broad services that include and require broad clinical competencies within the person's own profession. Plus, they will have an area of depth or areas of depth, or what the doctors call special skills. Our medical rural generalist colleagues use the term special skills, I think, as a bit of a counterpoint to specialist skills that would tend to be regarded as the domain of their metro specialist colleagues. So we've sort of adopted that lingo as well. As an example, a rural generalist pharmacist, for example, will have a broad range of competencies related to their own profession and be able to provide a broad range of clinical pharmacy services. Within their local service setting, their area of depth, an individual's area of depth, maybe something like antimicrobial stewardship. So that's an area of sort of special skills or greater depth of skills that that individual possesses, which is a skill that they bring to their community and to their team. The rural generalist, what we have been working towards is recognition of the rural generalist skill set such that it becomes a more defined skill set for each of our key allied health professions, rather than what I think has historically been regarded as rural generalists, which has kind of been an amorphous grab bag of sort of broad clinical areas of practice. So in trying to define and recognise the skill set, what we have identified is that obviously one rural generalist will differ from another rural generalist within the same profession because of the influence of their service and team requirements and the influence of their health outcome, the health needs of their community. My final point around the definition of rural generalist as it relates to individual health practitioners is that the term rural generalist is important not to be confused with the term generic health worker. A generic health worker does not have a primary health qualification, and that's not what we're talking about when we talk about the allied health rural generalist pathway. The outcome of the pathway from a workforce perspective is a good quality rural generalist speech pathologist, or a good quality rural generalist pharmacist, or a rural generalist physiotherapist. We're not talking about a blending into a sort of generic health worker. Next slide, mate. And finally, rural generalist education and training. As Kath mentioned before, the focus of the rural generalist pathway to date has been primarily on the what we call the developing rural generalist or early career rural generalist. The Queensland Health several years ago developed the Allied Health Rural Generalist Education Framework, and that's available on the Allied Health Professions Office of Queensland website. The education framework defines the clinical and non-clinical capabilities of what is now 9 professions working in rural generalist practice. The education framework in recent years has been used by James Cook University, who are working in collaboration with QUT to develop a formal 2-level postgraduate study program. That study program is called the Rural Generalist Program. The Rural Generalist Program is designed to complement allied health rural generalist training positions, so designated early career training positions. And so students who are undertaking the Rural Generalist Program are assumed to have profession-specific supervision and training support, which for level 1, which is basically new graduates, level 1 program participants, that supervision is assumed to be at least partly co-located. They're also assumed to have participating in a local service development project and have time allocated for work integrated learning. Within Queensland, the time allocation is between 0.1 and 0.2 FTE. So that's roughly between 4 and 8 hours per week. Students are also assumed to be working clinically in a generalist role. So putting it all together, the workforce and employment, education and training and service elements of the pathway, this is basically what it looks like. As I mentioned before, the work to date, particularly at a national level, has been focusing on the first 2 steps there, the developing rural generalist stage. We break it into 2 because stage 1 is really the immediate new graduate phase, sort of 0 to 2 years. The stage 2 developing rural generalist is someone who has 2 years or more professional experience, but is still on their sort of developing rural generalist trajectory. You can see within this graphic that a description of basically the workforce, education and service expectations of the developing rural generalists at stage 1 and stage 2. As I mentioned before, the expectations around workforce support and supervision for stage 1 include a co-located profession-specific supervisor and more frequent structured formal workplace-based support and supervision. The stage 1 rural generalist will be undertaking the level 1 rural generalist education program, and about 4 hours a week are allocated to development time, as I mentioned. They will be developing competence in their own implementation of rural generalist service delivery strategies, and also supporting the development of rural generalist service delivery within their own team. At stage 2, the profession-specific supervision may be co-located or may be provided remotely, and there may also be greater use of interprofessional support, particularly local interprofessional support. From an education and training perspective, a stage 2 rural generalist trainee will be undertaking the level 2 rural generalist education program, which is a graduate diploma. And again, we allocate 4 hours a week to development time, development and supervision. In stage 2, the rural generalist trainee is demonstrating increasing leadership and integration of rural generalist service delivery strategies into their own practice, and providing more of a leadership function in terms of developing the service delivery model of the team. So they're the 2 phases of the developing rural generalist. A proficient rural generalist, I guess, is your, good standard experienced rural generalist practitioner. And that individual will be able to be providing clinical leadership within their team and within their setting in relation to their own rural generalist practice within their profession. And they may be working towards, or they will be working towards developing advanced skills, perhaps advanced or extended scope or complex practice clinical skills, or maybe working on their leadership and management skills, education or research. They will take an increasing role in the education, mentoring and practice supervision of early career practitioners within their team. And then the 4th step, which we're not going to go into within this discussion today, but just for your noting that there is also the advanced and complex practice stage, which as we get towards this stage, what we find within Queensland Health is that a practitioner working in advanced and complex practice in clinical practice, management, education, research, or a combination of those within a rural generalist setting, their education and training and their competencies start to look very much like those of their urban counterparts. Next one, Matt. So just some summary slides now about the rural generalist pathway. So firstly, what it is. So the rural generalist pathway is a strategy that has been designed by health services and that can be adopted by health service organisations to improve their service and workforce sustainability and outcomes. The rural generalist pathway supports an own-grown workforce approach. So that's an approach used by an organisation to address the churn of workforce turnover and over time incrementally build capacity and stability and sustainability within their own workforce. It is a structure and a process for rural workforce development and service development, and I guess just for noting that all of those resources, or pretty much all of the resources required to implement the rural generalist pathway within your organisations are basically available for implementation now. The education and training program, the postgraduate education and training program, was pretty much the last component. It is now almost fully developed, just a couple of subjects that are remaining that haven't been run yet, but it's basically done now and the evaluation is nearing conclusion. So it's effectively ready to go. But the other component, I think, just a note for the rural generalist pathway is, although there are specifications with regard to the service, workforce and education and training components and the supporting resources, The rural generalist pathway is designed to be adaptable to local needs. Next one, Mark. And now I guess what it's not. We can't oversell it. Queensland Health and SARRAH are made significant advocates for the rural generalist pathway, but it's not a panacea. Firstly, what it's not a recognition pathway for existing experienced staff. So this isn't a titling or endorsement process. The title or the label of rural generalist is not a protected title under legislation. Anyone can call themselves a rural generalist. There's no prohibition and there's no hurdle requirement to use that title currently. So this isn't a recognition pathway for those who are already consider themselves to be working within a rural generalist scope. It's also not a scholarship program or a CPD program for individual allied health professionals. The pathway, by definition, has organisation-derived and developed service development, workforce development, as well as the education program components to it. That isn't to say, though, that the education program cannot be used independently as a CPD resource. Queensland Health has funded a number of our staff in both rural and urban locations to do individual modules or subjects within the rural generalist program, like project management or project evaluation. It's a good option for CPD. So I'm not discounting that. I'm just saying that basically an isolated implementation of the education program is not what the pathway is. It's not necessarily the right strategy for every service and setting. We have tended to find that where a service and a team are in a period of significant organisational change or lack local leadership, then piling the service development, education and training requirements onto that team can be counterproductive. So the rural generalist pathway, although it can be implemented in any allied health rural or remote service, I think is best suited to those that have a foundation level of organisational leadership and support available to it. So as I said before, it's not a panacea, but it's certainly a key element of strategic development of rural and remote services. Next one. And just briefly Kath briefly spoke to this, but just to provide an outline of where this has come from. It's not something that has just popped into our head necessarily in the last 6 months. We started work on the rural generalist pathway in 2013 through a multi-jurisdictional project across Northern Australia that was auspiced by the Greater Northern Australia Regional Training Network. As part of that project, which defined elements of what is now the education framework, we developed the first phase of the National Allied Health Rural Generalist Pathway Project Governance Group. That just included Northern Australian jurisdictions and SARRAH at that time. In 2014, Queensland Health developed our first designated early career rural generalist training positions. They were a trial, just 12-month supernumerary positions, and 11 of them. And at the same time, we funded Southern Cross University to evaluate our first cohort. In 2015 and 16, Queensland Health launched our second cohort of 11 training positions, and they were for 2 years duration, having found in the evaluation in 2014 that 1 year was inadequate. We also developed the education framework for our first 7 professions. Those professions were dietetics and nutrition, occupational therapy, podiatry, pharmacy, physiotherapy, speech pathology, and pharmacy. In 2017, the rural generalist training positions, designated training positions, were created in the Northern Territory, Western Australia and New South Wales. So we had multi-jurisdictional expansion, and we also launched the third 2-year cohort in Queensland Health. There was a transition of national leadership from Carnarvon, which was dissolved in 2017, to SARRAH, And that gave us opportunity to really expand our reach nationally, truly nationally, away from our Northern Australian origins. And in 2017, Queensland Health formed an agreement with JCU, working in association with QUT, to commence the Level 1 Rural Generalist Program, which started in May of that year. In 2018, JCU and QUT commenced offering the Level 2 Rural Generalist Program, the Graduate Diploma in Rural Generalist Practice. And at the same time, Queensland Health funded the Australian Healthcare and Hospitals Association to develop the Allied Health Rural Generalist Postgraduate Education Accreditation System. That accreditation system is for postgraduate education programs. It's published on the Allied Health Professions Office of Queensland website, and effectively is awaiting the growth of demand and numbers of trainees before we move into an implementation phase. In 2019, our Allied Health Rural Generalist training positions expanded into Tasmania and South Australia, and Queensland moved out of its 5-year trial phase of 11 supernumerary positions into a system embedding phase. And at the same time, in 2019, we also published the revisions to the Allied Health Rural Generalist Education Framework that added our last 2 professions, social work and psychology. And JCU have been contracted to extend the existing Rural Generalist program to include clinical training opportunities for social work and psychology. This is our current status of implementation of rural generalist training positions for early career practitioners in the public health system. We have 33 in Queensland, 4 in the Territory, 13 in South Australia, 8 in Tasmania, and 4 in New South Wales. We have 1 or more rural generalist training positions for each of the 9 professions listed there that are the ones that are in the scope of the Rural Generalist Program. Next slide. And just in terms of evaluation, we have evaluation reports published on the Allied Health Professions Office of Queensland website. As I mentioned before, Southern Cross University did a qualitative evaluation of our 2014 cohort, which is published. The Queensland Health have published our implementation reports from the 2014 cohort, 2015-16 cohort, and 2017-18 cohort. In addition, the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre for Nursing and Midwifery Education and Research, very long title, have been contracted by Queensland Health to evaluate the 2017 to 2019 rural generalist training positions implementation across 4 states, including and with a specific focus on the education and training component and the rural generalist program. We also have evaluations occurring in the Territory, Tasmania, New South Wales and South Australia, and 2 journal articles in process. But just briefly, the evaluation outcomes from Queensland for our 2014 to 18 trial. We had 37 positions that were advertised. We had failed recruitment on 2 of those. Both of those failed recruitments were in January of 2014. We haven't had a failed recruitment since then. So 95% of advertised positions were filled, which is a good outcome for rural and remote. Our retention in our 1 or 2 year training positions was 91%. Our rural retention, that is retention after separation from the temporary rural generalist training position, was impacted significantly by the fact that we used a supernumerary funding model during the trial. Effectively, the trainees got to the end of their position and they separated from the position and the position ceased to exist. So that obviously meant that there were very few options for them to take up positions in their training location unless there happened to opportunistically be a position available at the time. So our separation outcome 6 months post separation from the training position, we retain about 71% in rural, regional and remote, and then that drops to about 56% at 24 months. And crucially for us, this is a health service driven pathway strategy, as I mentioned at the start. So our service outcomes are why we're doing this. The workforce elements are important for us and are obviously a key enabler of service stability in rural and remote areas. But Queensland Health has invested in this. Our health service partners interstate have invested in this because we are focused on better health outcomes for our rural and remote communities. These are 4 examples of service development outcomes that have been implemented in rural generalist training sites in projects that have been led by senior members of the team but have had substantial contributions of our rural generalist trainees. I won't read them, you can read them. Next slide, Matt. And over to you, Kat.
Oh, that's right, that's me. Hi. So I know that you're all probably bursting with questions for Ilse off the back of that presentation. If you can just hold on to them for 2 more slides. I would just like to walk you through what for Sarah is the next stage of implementation of the Rural Generalist Pathway nationally. And then we can open it up for some questions. And just a reminder at this point, if you have questions, that you can use the chat function, and we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation, but we'll see how we go. So Sarah has been funded a 2-year project to implement the Rural Generalist Pathway nationally, and particularly looking at proof of concept and applicability in the private and non-government sectors. So as Ilse has just explained, there's been some fantastic results demonstrated by the application in Queensland and in state-based services. And what we need to do now is look at how that might work for the private and non-government sectors. So Sarah's been funded to establish 40 new allied health rural generalist trainee positions over the 2-year period, to engage service providers in multiple sectors, health, disability, private, to take up rural generalist traineeships, to facilitate an accreditation mechanism for the allied health rural generalist program coursework, working alongside key stakeholders there, and to establish the requisite organisational structure and intellectual capital to sustain the allied health rural generalist pathway beyond the life of the pilot. As you can probably gather, this has been an alliance. There's been many hands and many jurisdictions have been involved in this, and that will continue to be the case as this work unfolds. So the allied health rural generalist training positions must include the following elements. There will be a dedicated development supervision time of minimum 0.1 up to 0.2 FTE, participation in a formal rural generalist education program, such as the Rural Generalist Program offered by JCU in collaboration with the Queensland University of Technology. At this point, and Ilse, correct me if I'm wrong, but JCU is the only university who is offering this coursework, and but the door is open for other universities to come on board once we have that critical mass of trainees happening across the country to make that worthwhile. There will be a formal development plan aligned with the Rural Generalist Education Program and requirements of the employing service. Development funding to support the application in the education, to support participation in the education program. Regular formal supervision with profession-specific local supervisors. A contribution to the rural generalist service development strategies that improve client care and service outcomes. So the participants will be involved in a service development project and apply the learnings from their training modules to what in the private and NGO sector might be the local business development strategy. So Ilse gave some fantastic examples of the results that they've seen in Queensland Health. Employers could look at this as a way to achieve some of their strategic goals through the projects undertaken in conjunction with these trainees. And so the packages will actually cover the cost of the coursework, the salary backfill for the trainee to complete on-the-job development and supervision, travel and accommodation associated to complete the Rural Generalist Education Program and/or clinical placements, as the case may be, and other unforeseen costs subject to negotiation. The employer will still be required, obviously these are for positions that exist, so the employer is still responsible for the trainee salary, on costs, entitlements, their usual employment conditions, with the minimum 0.1 FTE of the position allocated to development, training and supervision activities. The employer is also responsible as the primary clinical supervisor, allocating approximately an hour a week for formal supervision and additional time for workplace-based support and teaching. The time investment of the manager and team and any related resourcing requirements for service development project, and any other development costs for work shadowing or clinical placements, additional courses outside the Rural Generalist Program, mandatory training, and so on. So that's the package. We'll be reaching out to employers. We will be working with other interested players in this space, like the health workforce agencies, like primary health networks, in order to identify appropriate circumstances where we might implement trainee positions. We are currently in the process of advertising. Well, advertising is closed for our project manager, so that position will be a 2-year position with key result areas based on the project objectives. And so that's about it. I'm going to probably stop sharing the screen now, so you're all going to come online, and you can switch on your cameras if you wish. And if you have a question, perhaps if you just wave and I will unmute your microphone. So, are there any questions for Ilse or for myself? Catherine.
I put one on the, hi, how are you?
Good.
I put one on the group chat, but just I was curious about looking at the not-for-profit and the private sector. So a lot of small private practices don't employ allied health professionals, but they contract. Will they still be eligible for the scheme if it's a contract arrangement?
It will be for the package will support the trainee. So unless that person, it would be the employer of that person. If they're a private practitioner, we would have to review their circumstances. But obviously, if they're a sole practitioner, all of those issues around where they'll gain their supervision, support, you know, how they will apply rural generalist principles would need to be reviewed, looked at. So,
because I imagine there'll be lots of quirky one-off sort of setups. But if they're not a sole practitioner, certainly here in Western Australia, a lot of private practices do not employ someone as a direct employee, but they have a contract arrangement. So they might be working in a practice with 2 or 3 people, but they're not actually an employee. So Is that still possible?
It might be, but we'd need to talk to that practice, look at that circumstance, and they need to be able to meet the requirements. So it would be, we would still review it. We'd look at it at a case-by-case basis, but yeah, they would need to meet those minimum standards. Any other questions? Reminding people that you can use the chat room, or if you have a camera, switch your camera on and wave at me. All right. Well, Ilse, you must have done a fantastic job. Oh, hold on. LJ Moo has asked a question. How will we be letting employers know? I think that what we'll need to do is to go via those people that are engaging. We can go via the primary health networks in rural locations that have that knowledge of where practices are. We can talk to health services as well. There is a lot of work that's being done within the state-based health services around integrated care and how they work with primary healthcare providers. So there would be people with some knowledge there. And we can work with, if Sarah, as a member of ALF, the Australian Leadership Forum, Allied Health Leadership Forum, will be working alongside of the professions as well. So hopefully we will be able to negotiate some means to communicate with those interested parties within their professions. But primary health networks, health workforce agencies is the other one. So in New South Wales, it's the Rural Doctors Network. In Queensland, that's the Queensland Health Workforce Agency. So there are a number of health workforce agencies that will also have good relationships with private sector. The other people are in the disability sector. For example, you've got the National Disability National Disability Services. That is the peak body for service providers in the disability space. So we've started connecting with those people. So there's a range of mechanisms that we can use to get the message out. Catherine asks, are there any other training organisations looking at developing accredited programs? Ilse, do you have any information? Is there anything that you can speak to on this issue?
I don't think so. Well, I don't know. As in, we know that there are a number of education providers, universities, UDRHs, in professional associations that have an interest in elements of the education. We are certainly not aware of any, or no organisations have identified to us that they're planning on developing a rural generalist program to meet or a program of education that meets the education framework today.
Yeah. While there is a level of interest, it still revolves around having enough demand to make that worthwhile for another provider to come on board. So, and just noting that LJ Moo is actually Nee Moore. Sorry, Nee, but thank you for providing your full name. So Matthew asks, as a current Masters of Medical Imaging student, what could I do during late degree, early career stage to be a strong candidate for this scheme later? Ilse, you're probably better.
So I'm making an assumption, Matthew, that you're it's a graduate entry Masters, hey? I would assume. Masters of Engineering. So yes,
yes.
Thank you. Excellent. I think, well, I don't know, mate. I mean, really, for for entry-level programs, whether they're master's or bachelor's degree, most of them are relatively set, as in the curriculum for most of the allied health professions is, really crowded. So, in terms of, there's usually very little capacity to make selection decisions on subjects, because often there is no capacity for selection. There's no electives within entry-level programs. But having said that, I think that the entry requirements from an educational perspective into the Level 1 Rural Generalist program is just that someone has completed their entry-level qualification, like graduate entry masters, in one of the 9 allied health professions that are in scope. So just by completing your Masters in Medical Imaging course, then that would allow you, that would be the eligibility criteria from an education perspective. Then more broadly, just in terms of putting you in a good position in moving into a training role, then I think, engagement in your local rural health club within your university, I think, is a very good opportunity to gain an understanding about rural generalist practice in medical imaging, and also for the other professions. So that would be a recommendation at a university level. No worries.
And I think this is a comment from Lee that I liked the names that Ilse used earlier, the rural generalist pharmacist, rural generalist podiatrist, that marketing with those words will help private sector understand this isn't a generic health worker. So yes, I agree. Terminology is critical. So thanks for that comment, Lee. Anna Parker says, it was mentioned that telehealth is a major component of service delivery. Are you currently partnered with any telehealth providers? So from Sarah's perspective, the answer is no. We're still in a very formative stage. As I said, we're still recruiting our project manager, who will then flesh out the high-level plan that we have already. But that's an interesting concept. Anna, do you have any background there? Is there something that you'd like to speak to? Because I could unmute you if you wanted to speak to that. Anna, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. So I'm currently an intern at UMBO, which is a startup company. They're aiming to create an online platform to provide speech and occupational therapy. So it's sort of aimed at rural and remote areas because there's not as much access there. I guess that was sort of my standpoint from listening in to this webinar was, my interest is obviously in the telehealth area. And so I was quite interested. That was one of the 4 major service delivery components of this pathway. So there's definitely a major link there.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, any other questions? Okay, well, if that's the case, if there are no more questions, then I can give you another 5 minutes back into your evening so that you can switch off. So I will take this opportunity to thank everybody for their participation this evening. We really appreciate the time you take to join us. And thank you very much to Ilse for taking time out of her day and with her sore vocal cords to come and speak. So we really appreciate that, Ilse. And please feel free to contact us if you have any further questions. This will be recorded and placed on our website so that others can access it if they want the information. So please let people know. So thank you very much for your time, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, everyone.
Good
Bye.
night.